Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Brian Winter. I'm the Vice President of Policy for the American Society and Council of the Americas. I'm also the editor-in-chief of our magazine, America's Quarterly. This morning's event is called Latin America and the Globalization Myth, which looks at a new book, hot off the presses, by my friend Shannon O'Neill of the Council on Foreign Relations, who is also our guest this morning. This book is comprehensive. It is easy to read. It's a pleasure to read. And at 169 pages, it's only as long as it needs to be, which I think is an underrated quality in books. But every once in a while, there's a book that makes you change the way that you look at the world. I think this is one of those books. I'm not just saying this because Shannon is my friend. It is a full-throated case for the benefits of trade, especially with our neighbors. This book has important implications for the United States, Mexico, Canada, as well as other countries all over the hemisphere, and is very much worth your time. Before we start, I'd like to remind you that this event is on the record. We'll start with a conversation between Shannon and me of about 30 minutes. And then for the final quarter hour or so, we'll take some questions for you, which we'd like to ask that you submit through the Q&A function here on Zoom. So without further ado, Shannon, welcome. Thank you for being here. And I was hoping that perhaps you could start by explaining what you mean by the globalization myth and why it's relevant today.
Sure. Well, thank you, Brian, for having me. Thank you for the Council of the Americas, and welcome to everyone. Glad to be here. There are two things that I think we get wrong about globalization when we look at this last, 40 years of these, the quote unquote golden days of globalization, if you're a fan, and the terrible days of globalization if you're a critic of it. But there's two things I do think we get wrong. The first is that globalization has just not been as widespread and pervasive as we tend to think. And so there are really only about 24 countries that have seen their economies transform with trade over these last 40 years. So that's one thing. So there's, almost 90 countries where trade as a percentage of GDP either stayed the same or it actually declined over these last 40 years. So they, really deglobalized rather than globalized. So that's one part. The other part is that for those countries and those companies that did internationalize, that did go abroad, and of course there are many, they didn't tend to go as far as we think. They tended not to globalize, but more often they regionalized. So they tended to go next door or stay in the neighborhood when they looked for suppliers or when they looked for customers or when they spent their money. So that is also different than I think we usually think about it. And so when you combine these two together, that not all that many countries participated in it, and those that did tended to stay close to home rather than go broadly, go across the world, you see a very different globalization than I think we also often think about. And actually what we see is three big regions that were part of this wave, that really rode this wave: an Asian one, a European one, and somewhat a North American one. But then many other countries that really were not part of this process much at all. And that's where I think we see much of Latin America, frankly.
And that's what you mean in the other term that you use in the book, which is regionalization. You're talking about this phenomenon where actually what we've seen is these three clusters kind of dominating trade more than sort of true globalization, the way that we've traditionally thought about it.
Yeah, exactly. We see it intensify over these last 40 years. And so, for instance, in Asia, you go back to the 1970s or 1980, and only about a third of the trade and the money that flowed around stayed within Asia. The rest went more broadly. Today, if you look at that trade, it's over 60%. So most of what Asia trades with each other. Most of where they put their foreign direct investment or their bank loans and are with each other. And that, I think, has really made them a powerful force on the global stage with global consumers. If I look at the China story, it's not necessarily a story of globalization. It's a story of regionalization within Asia that then allowed goods that come out of China to be, high quality and affordable that, we buy here in the United States or Latin Americans buy or people buy all over the world.
One of the things I really liked about this book, Shannon, is you talk a lot about your own youth and your own experiences growing up in Akron, Ohio, which is a part of the country that I know well, has really suffered a lot of kind of in the face of industrial decline in the United States over the last 40 years or so. How did your own personal story influence you in your decision to write this book?
So I grew up in Akron, Ohio, and it is a poster child for the Rust Belt, and often, sort of this poster child for the victim of globalization, or the way the narrative often is plays out in the policy spaces and in politics or in the newspapers, right? That this is what happens, right, with globalization. And growing up there, one is, as I started looking at the economic data and looking at some of the trade figures, the timing is just off in many ways. So Akron, Ohio lost its jobs in the late 70s, the early 80s. It wasn't NAFTA that took the jobs. NAFTA was a decade away and not even an idea, I think, in a lot of people's minds at the time. It wasn't that, it was something else, right? And it was technology that was coming in from France and from Japanese tire makers that made better tires than the Akron folks did, right? They had different technologies. But it was also that these other places around the world, they were regionalizing already. Japan was making tires and cars all over Asia. Europe was doing the same, and Akron, Ohio, and towns like it, they were left alone in this process. They were looking just at the United States, and they didn't have partners where they could have, economies of scale or specialization or different wage rates that would allow their products to be more affordable, or access to other markets, frankly, that the Japanese tire makers had that the European ones did. And that, to me, is the sad story of Akron's demise in many ways, which was led by tires. But it's also, I do think, the way that we get out of this, or the way that we can go forward, is if you think about regionalization, if you think about creating industrial clusters that aren't just bound by a city or a state or even a country, you think about them internationally. You think about manufacturing today being a team sport. You need to do it across a number of countries. Then I think that's a way that the United States and the Akrons and other countries, frankly, that are struggling can get back into the game.
You wrote one of the sentences very early in the book that really grabbed my attention and made me think, wow, this is a really important book, was precisely on this point. You wrote, "The city's struggles reflect less the vagaries of globalization than the costly consequences of the United States' limited regionalization."
And that's exactly what I find. It's that if you try to go it alone, then you will be buffeted by others who are joining together and making things that are higher quality, that they're finding innovation in the back and forth, that they're able to specialize, and they're able to make things that appeal to global consumers because the prices are cheaper. And that is, I think, the US does this in some areas. And so just talking about the US, and we can talk about other countries as well, the US does this well, for instance, in the auto industry. And the way it's been able to do it in the auto industry, I would argue, is precisely because of NAFTA and now USMCA. And let me give you one company story that illustrates this. So Cummins Engines. Cummins Engines is a huge engine producer. They're based in Indiana, or in Columbus, Indiana. So, kind of like Akron, but Columbus, Indiana, not too far away. And they, were formed in 1919. So between the two worlds, they grew in the post-war period and were a powerhouse. And then they started to lose their mojo in the 1970s and 1980s. They faced engines coming in from Japan that were more fuel efficient and didn't break down as often. They faced some also from Europe, and they were really struggling. And there's a question about whether they were going to survive. Then comes NAFTA, and Cummins revives. And it revives for a couple of reasons that are really specific to NAFTA. One is they were able to begin compete against Japanese engines because they could make things, they could send some production to Mexico and make things cheaper than they had. They were able to put in place leaner production. They were also able to access markets that they had never accessed before. In fact, the Mexican truck market, now Cummins engines are the leading engines for the Mexico truck market, which they never had been before because it opened up that market to them. And by making across a number of countries, they were able to compete more globally. And now they're right back on top. And their factory in New York, state of New York, now supplies Mexican truckers, and you see a much more global company. And so that path is one that was not open to Akron in the 1980s, but was open to Columbus, Indiana in the 1990s, and is one of the reasons that Cummins is still a huge company.
I do want to get into what this means for Mexico and Canada and other countries in the hemisphere. But first, I want to ask you about US politics, because I think it's so central to this question. And if we are to translate much of the history that you talk about in the book to the politics of today, I think it's just very necessary that we put this right up front. the political mood in the United States is not a pro-trade mood. In fact, you have towards the end of the book, you say something to the effect of the United States has no trade policy at the moment. For the first time in my lifetime, we really have both parties in Washington, the Republicans and the Democrats, that are either indifferent or in many cases hostile towards trade. So how does this book mesh with the current political moment, and how hopeful are you that perhaps we could see some momentum behind a trade agenda again sometime soon?
This is hard, right? Washington right now, as you say, nobody is for trade and for big, ambitious deals. And that would be the first best case, right? Is that the US would go out and actually open up markets that our US producers and products from the US actually don't have access to or don't have preferred access to. And one of the sad aspects of the US pulling out of the TPP, now the CPTPP, which was the Pan-Pacific agreement with countries on both sides of the Pacific Ocean, many in Asia, is that those countries have moved ahead, and now US products are much more expensive in those markets compared to those that are members of those markets. So, US beef costs 12% more in Japanese and Australian markets than Canadian beef because Canada signed the agreement and the US did not sign the agreement. And there's lots of other examples of that. So that's one, but look, let's face it, we're not going to go back to trade agreements like that. That doesn't mean that you can't make progress and you can't deepen regionalization and regional supply chains, which I do think will make US-based companies and US-based workers more profitable and more competitive. So keeps jobs here and expands jobs here. And part of that is because, at least in the Western Hemisphere, the US actually already has a lot of free trade agreements. The US only has free trade agreements with less than 10% of the globe's GDP, so very few, but most of those are actually in the Western Hemisphere. So you already have market access. What you don't yet have, or what you could do better, is reducing the other frictions, not the tariffs, but the regulations or the other barriers or the ease of doing business across these borders that allow companies to make things together that are better quality and cost less. So there, I do think there's space, and that doesn't necessarily have to run through the sort of, on the third rail of US politics necessarily. And I would say there's a few places to start, right? The US government, the Biden administration, but with support from Congress, has decided a couple of things. It's decided, one is that there are a number of industries and products that we need to decouple from China because we just don't trust our access to it, and sort of the geopolitics of it makes us vulnerable. So that's one. And two, you have bipartisan support from the Congress and hundreds of billions of dollars, in the case trillions of dollars, to do so in particular sectors, right? We have an infrastructure bill that's passed to improve US infrastructure. We have a CHIPS Act. We're going to put $50+ billion behind creating a semiconductor supply chain out of China. And then we also have the Inflation Reduction Act, which focuses on clean energy issues and also has tens of billions of dollars to recreate or to create clean energy supply chains or clean tech supply chains out of China and other places. So this, to me, is an opportunity not just to make those US focused, but to think a bit more broadly how you would make those secure and sustainable and, in the end, commercially viable. You need more than the United States. So I think this is a place to start.
Well, and in terms of what can be done outside the realm of FTAs, you cite several specific examples in the book. You mentioned infrastructure just now. Can you tell the story that you tell towards the end of the book about this bridge that was built over the US-Mexico border near Brownsville back in 2015, and how long it had been since there'd been an infrastructure upgrade of that kind?
Yeah. So I think there's two things here. One is we just don't build enough infrastructure, and there, this had been a century in the waiting before we had gotten to this bridge. And we had one of our first rail crossings in a century built just in the last decade as well. And given that Mexico is the largest trading partner for the United States and vice versa, it makes no sense that you wouldn't have more back and forth. The other challenge is that the infrastructure that is there, often it's old, it hasn't been updated. It hasn't been updated physically in terms of the road itself or the number of lanes. It hasn't been updated technologically, sort of the digital back and forth that makes traffic easier. And then we also don't often, or as much as we should, coordinate with our neighbors. So there are cases where we build a brand new spanking facility and we spend millions of dollars on our side of the border, but the Mexicans or the Canadians, depending on it, aren't part of that process, and so they don't build up their side, which slows down what should have been a real improvement in the back and forth. So infrastructure is definitely something. And one of the biggest, when I talk to companies and I talk to people who run the supply chains, or they're thinking about where they should put their global footprint, logistics matters a lot, and particularly in the age of automation and the like. Sometimes logistics costs more than labor costs. They think about this more, and so easing that movement back and forth will make North America, but then by extension, the United States, a more attractive place to put your business.
Just a reminder to those who are attending, you can submit questions via the Q&A feature on the chat here on Zoom. We'll start taking those in a little while. Before we do, though, Shannon, we focused so much so far on the former NAFTA, now USMCA countries, Mexico and Canada. That makes sense. And that's the focus of a lot of what you write about in the book. But you also mentioned Central America and include some specifics there that really brought home for me just how valuable it would be if we in the United States could incorporate some of those countries more in our supply chain. And you cited the specific case of clothing. And you said that Central American countries can get clothes, I'll just read from the book, can get clothes to U.S. wearers faster, reducing the time from design sketch to Amazon box from Asia's 6 months to Central America's 10 weeks, from 6 months to 10 weeks. Now, that just kind of blew my mind a little bit. Where can you talk a little bit about how much opportunity there is for some of the Central American countries to take part in what we're discussing here?
I think there is a big opportunity. I mean, one of the facets of the last, the beginning of the 21st century is so much of the apparel that was made in the Western Hemisphere, in the United States, but in the Western Hemisphere generally disappeared and went to Asia and really went wholesale. And this is, again, it is a story about regional supply chains, in that people make these, or companies decide to make things together regionally rather than globally. And so once one part moves, when you set up a factory in China, the suppliers are very likely to be from the rest of Asia, not from Central America, not from the United States or Mexico. You see these chains develop, and then they might sell to consumers globally. And so that was a loss for the Western Hemisphere. So you saw all of this move. But because of consumer demands, we all want things yesterday from Amazon or wherever we're ordering it. And because of fast fashion, people, you don't want to wait 6 months for that design, because maybe then you'll be looking to some other, something you've seen on TikTok elsewhere. And so that really is an opportunity. The challenge are a couple of challenges. One is you can't just bring back the first part. You can't just bring back the stitching or the cutting. You need to bring back the whole chain in order to make it profitable, because that's why they all went there in the first place, is to be all near each other and to allow the profitability. So you need to bring it all the way back. So you need to bring it all the way back from the synthetic threads making that we are all the athleisure that we wear, all the way through the process to to the packaging at the end. And so that's a heavy lift. It could be profitable here, but you need all of those steps along the way. And that might need government support to get things up and running. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is some of these are not very high skill, but they're not low skill either. And the way the world has changed over these last 20 years is that there is some medium level skills. And so there needs to be training for a lot of these jobs. But none of those are insurmountable, but that is to bring it back to Central America, to bring it back to the Western Hemisphere more broadly, that's what it would entail.
So this idea of bringing supply chains closer to home, it's a big, there's a lot of buzz around this right now. It was the subject of an issue of America's Quarterly earlier this year, for which you wrote an excellent cover story that took some of the concepts that you talk about in the book and fleshed them out a bit for a Latin American audience. But look, here again, the politics around some of these things are difficult, and timing counts for a lot. And as this moment is presenting itself, the United States is not the only country in the hemisphere where we see some of these political challenges to implementation. And I want to be very specific and kind of call things by their name. The Mexican government under Andrés Manuel López Obrador, at the moment, it's a very difficult moment for the diplomatic relationships within the USMCA, given what's happening with the challenge over energy. There were even rumors a couple of weeks ago, unconfirmed, that Mexico might be reconsidering its role in the USMCA. I mean, how much of an impact does that have on these opportunities right now? And is it realistic to think that some of these opportunities that you outline in the book will really be seized upon?
Mhm. I do worry that the region is missing a moment. I mean, as I look at all of these factors out there, automation and demographics and the costs of climate and climate change and the way people are rethinking their supply chain footprint as a result. As I look at the geopolitics and the US-China decoupling, all of the policies both countries are putting in place, this is a once in a generation moment for fluidity in supply chains. Every board of directors is at least talking about this if they're not actually doing something, if they have a global footprint. So this is a moment, and over the next 3 to 5 years, many of these corporations are going to decide where to put their next factory or their next operation, or hire their next engineers and back offices and the like. And this is a moment when Latin America broadly, many of these countries could benefit, but not if they're not prepared. And I think Mexico here is a classic example. This should be Mexico's moment, because it's tied to the US, because it has already a pretty complex, diversified, advanced manufacturing ecosystem there. So it already has a lot of suppliers, it already has a lot of know-how and technology and the like. So something that lots of companies can build upon. But they're not coming for precisely the reason that you just said, that there's worries about the politics of it. There's worries about the stability of USMCA, which is really underpinning so much of this. That said, that's the federal government point of view. If you go to the state level, if you go to the border, you do see a lot of investment. You do see a lot of dynamism, frankly, in terms of companies coming and expanding capacity. So it's not stopping all of it. But the counterfactual, how much investment you would be seeing, how many jobs you would be being created, I think that's the downside of this, the political risk, as you would say.
What is it specifically that governments in the region, and I want to talk about the US side of the equation here, but I want to talk about Latin America, Mexico, these Central American countries first. What is it that these countries need to be doing, these governments need to be doing, in order to take fuller advantage of this regionalization opportunity?
So a big part is infrastructure. You need to have the infrastructure so that companies can come in and do the things that they need to do. So that means, roads and rails and ports that will connect them to the suppliers that they might have and the markets that they want to go to. It means stable sources of energy, particularly for manufacturing. You need a lot of energy in order to keep the lights on and make sure that your production is stable. It means investment in digital technologies, in sort of fiber optics, all that kind of thing, because increasingly, even manufacturing is a digital process, right? That is a big part of where we're headed. So that is important. And then it is the bigger sort of medium to longer term. It is education, so that you have the right kind of workers, the skills for the 21st century. We're far into the 21st century, and many of Latin America's education systems aren't training their children and their students and their people, middle-aged people, to access what the jobs are of today and frankly of the future. So all of those aspects really matter. I would also say is that yes, the US market matters, and yes, that's part of it, but these countries are not turning to each other. And I think as I look at the last 40 years and why Latin America was slow to grow, why we haven't seen the innovations, why we haven't seen the technological advances, is that each of them really tried to go alone, or they became a hub and spoke with the United States or with China. And that part I think is missing. So how do you reach out to your neighbors? How do you design industrial policies, for lack of a better word, but how do you design some of these so you can create the economies of scale, the specialization, the bring in the technology that you wouldn't be able to do as one country alone, even big countries like Brazil. You need to, in my book is what I'm arguing is even the US can't do it alone. So Brazil, Peru, Chile, they can't do it alone either. But how do you forge those links and begin with particular industries or begin with particular economic activities so you can begin to climb that scale and provide better jobs and sort of a socioeconomic ladder for the future?
We have a lot of people from the private sector on this call, multinational companies with operations all over the hemisphere. Given the sort of the political difficulties that we face, what advice do you have for companies that are trying to take fuller advantage of this moment under the current circumstances, kind of leaving behind what we might see as ideal in terms of policy?
Yeah. So many of the reasons that these leaders were elected were, well, two things. One is that Latin America, which is a good thing, is mostly democratic. Voters matter, and voters get to say something, and they say things largely through the polls. So that, I think, is actually a good thing. In fact, there's more people living under democracy in the Western Hemisphere than any other. It's the most democratic region in the world. And that I do think for the long term is a very good thing. But it also means that voters are really frustrated. They're frustrated with inequality. They're frustrated with violence. They're frustrated with lacks of opportunity. They're frustrated with COVID and what that's meant for themselves and their family and their social fabric. And that is why we have gotten this anti-incumbent wave. And that is, like it or not, the reality of what multinationals are operating in. Now, it's not the only place in the world that has this. So, Latin America is not alone in the turn to anti-incumbency, to populism. And that is something, balancing. If you're a multinational, you're balancing those different sides. But so how do multinationals weather this? Some of these places, I do think many of these governments, not all of them, but many of them, there is a place to meet in the middle. And what they want to do, they will need multinationals. They will need companies and private sector to do, because you cannot create jobs. You cannot create new industries. You cannot actually begin to climb the technological scale and change these economies unless you have the private sector investment. And that is something that is necessary. So dialogue with these governments in the ways that you can have dialogue is important. And in places like Mexico, if it's not the federal government, then it can be the state government, because I do think there are voices in the policy realm that can be useful for those that are looking for another place to put some of their capacity or some of their operations.
We focused on North America so far, right? And I think it's no secret, my focus tends to be kind of more South America. And there you see a lot of buzz right now about their own agenda of perhaps greater regional integration, this idea that, especially at a moment where governments seem ideologically synchronized on the left, especially in their view, if Lula wins the runoff in Brazil on Sunday. As a brief sort of aside on that, I wish personally that ideological alignment was not a precondition for this kind of integration, but in practice, let's be honest, it often is, or at least is perceived as being so. There's a lot of buzz in the capitals like Santiago and Buenos Aires and elsewhere about the possibility that Latin America could take greater advantage of building its own links. My question, though, is whether many of these governments fundamentally, at the end of the day, believe in trade. I'm not sure they do. Where do you stand on this?
It's a hard part, and I have to say, actually, trade for South America, one, it's quite limited, particularly in places like Brazil, Argentina. These are closed economies, so trade is not a big part of their economy already. So there's not big impetus inside to push for it, because a lot of people haven't benefited from it. So I see that as one challenge. And the other side is they're not trading the kinds of things that would actually help their economy grow in the long run. And one of the hallmarks of Latin America over the last 20 years has been, what economists call premature deindustrialization. So they have lost their manufacturing sectors before they got out of the middle income trap. They're ending up stuck there. And a big part of this is that trade, the double-edged sword of trade with China. Trade with China has brought in lots of money. We've seen it soar, particularly over the beginning of the 20th century, and brought in lots of money to coffers that allowed, for instance, Brazil and other places to put in social programs that were vital to bring people out of poverty. So there's a good side to it. But the other side of it is that trade with China tends to be commodities going out and finished goods coming back in and undercutting local manufacturing that would have brought technological advancement and understanding or other kinds of expertise and know-how that's lost because those things are not being made in these countries. So they're not wrong in some ways that trade has its downsides or has its double-edged sword, because in many ways it's the wrong kind of trade. And so how do you get to the right kind of trade for Latin America, right? The trade that will actually bring jobs, that are jobs that are better than just those on sort of the edges of the supply chain. And that's where I do think this regionalization matters, right? It matters that you make manufactured goods in these countries, particularly where they are, sort of in the overall global economy. And what we know from Latin America in the 1970s or so is that it's hard to make a car by yourself, right? You saw the 1960s and 70s, the model was you throw up big protections, import substitution, industrialization. Everybody makes their own car, everybody makes their own blender, and what you get are really expensive cars that don't run very well, right? Same thing in the United States. We don't make cars anymore by ourselves, precisely because of that. Because if you want the latest technology and innovation, you need to bring in expertise and from all over the world. But if you have a bigger market, if you had Mercosur as a real market, if you had South America as a real market, you could make a car that actually could be competitive. You could make lots of things that would be competitive. You could actually be the place where some of the innovation that comes through the manufacturing process would be happening. And you would begin to climb some of those, value-added scale, which is, what many Asian countries did as well. I mean, they started off, you look at the 1960s and 70s, many Asian countries per capita were much poorer than Latin American countries. But by hooking into regional supply chains, by becoming factory Asia, which now makes half of the world's goods, they were able to grow their per capita income and bring prosperity.
I want to start to take some of the very good questions from the audience. Just a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, it's available through the Q&A function on Zoom here. A question here, and it goes to the heart of so much of this, Shannon. You mentioned the fact that how wonderful and positive it is that all the countries, or not all, so many Latin Americans live under democracy. I agree, of course. But the question is, how do you sell the benefits of regionalization to the voters of each country? And that's a question for here in the United States as well in so many of our countries, because the perception that you find, at least in some quarters, is that trade has been harmful.
So I don't think it's as hard as we make it out to be. It's hard. It's a heavy lift for sure, but I don't think it is impossible. And this is two reasons why. The first is that when you look at polling data in the United States, but also in Latin America, this is not an anti-trade constituency, right? Actually, there's a lot of support. The majority of Americans believe trade is an opportunity more than it's a threat. And Latin Americans, similarly, they see trade as a way to get out there in the world and as a way to improve their economic circumstances. So I don't think it is changing the minds of the population. It seems changing the minds of the politicians in certain cases. So I think that's part of it. And then the other is, I think the way you start is with particular industries or particular sectors. You don't just do trade generally. Find a way that that you can actually get at something that is, in the US, we would frame it as a national security issue. In Latin America, it could also be, national security or of national interest, right? And so here in the United States, for instance, we have identified 4 areas that we believe are critical supply chains that we need to have better control of. These are semiconductors, critical minerals, pharmaceuticals, and large capacity batteries, so electric vehicle batteries, basically. Start with those that everybody already agrees we need for national security reasons to have a better hold on. We need to be less vulnerable. And think about how you would build out that whole supply chain. So let's just take semiconductors as one. The US government has put $50 billion plus behind it to create a strong, secure semiconductor supply chain. Mostly we're focused here in the United States on the foundries, the actual making of the chips. But if you're going to have a secure supply chain, you need everything from mining the minerals, to processing the minerals, to the packaging and testing, to the recycling of the batteries. It needs to be the whole thing. You can't just have one part of it. And so as you think about that, no one country can do that economically, commercially viably. So spread it out over a couple of countries, and you understand it because of national security reasons. So testing and packaging could happen in other countries. It does in Asia, it goes all over Asia. Mostly China does testing and packaging, but you see these parts all over Asia. Think about it here too, because that's how you're going to make it resilient. And so that, I think, is the way into how do you start getting people to believe in trade and see the benefits. Start with a particular place or particular sector where you have an advantage.
You just following on that, you cite in the book this poll that says that 3 out of 4 Americans think that trade is a good idea. And then I wonder about this disconnect where, if that's true, then how did we land not only on America's first during the Trump administration, but a very similar sort of slogan. President Biden is always out there talking about the need to buy American and have so much focus on making things at home. I'm maybe another time we can sort of unpack that a bit.
We have a disconnect on a few other issues too, where the majority of Americans want things like gun control and the like, and our policies aren't there. So
yeah, fair enough. Well, let me ask a question here about China and its role in Latin America, and basically to paraphrase the question, China, as we sit here lamenting the stagnant regionalization of especially the North America space, China continues to expand its investment in and trade with Latin America and the Caribbean. I think most people, if not all people on this call, know that story well and how dramatically it's changed over the last 20 years. Is there a national security case to be made from the U.S. perspective for greater trade with the region, keeping in mind that historically over the years, national security has been a key component of who we strategically decide to trade with? What do you think?
I do think that there is an element there. As we look at the decoupling that's happening, and you look at the policies of the last 6 months in the United States, increasing number of export controls or import bans and reciprocated from China. So you are going to see a divide between these two economies in at least a number of sectors. And so as we see the world divide up a bit, where does Latin America fall? We've seen, as you say, a big increase in trade with China. Part of that trade is this commodity trade, right? It's the price of commodities and the demand for commodities. And much of that is over. It's over because China has already done that first step of global growth, where you invest in creating roads and rails and other things that increase your productivity and bring your population into a more industrialized base. And we won't see as much of that anymore. China's demographics are changing too. We don't need any more cities. I'm not sure they need much more real estate. They've got a lot of cities they're waiting already to be filled, and not a lot of children being born, or growth in terms of the population. But overall, some of that is going to change. But for the US, as we look at some of these issues, as I look at both the national security side for particular supply chains, but as I look at this larger issue of economic competitiveness, if the United States wants to have more business here in the US, if the United States wants to have more jobs here, it needs more and deeper and expansive regional supply chains. And those can move beyond Mexico and Canada. They can encompass more of the Western Hemisphere. But geography does matter here. It matters for logistics. It matters for cultures. It matters for time zones. It matters for other kinds of frictions that make things costly. So I think there is a national security interest in particular areas, but also more broadly, if you want a robust US economy, tying yourself to the Western Hemisphere, at least in part, is a way to go.
There's an interesting question here. I want to see if you agree with the sort of the framework on this one. It says the fact that in Latin America and Caribbean, countries decided to go alone in trade over the last 4 decades has a lot to do with the lobby from the United States that historically regarded the regionalization process in Latin America as a threat. Do you see that changing now? Do you agree with that?
Not sure I agree that the US was all that cognizant or actually that proactive in these policies. I mean, the only place you see the US proactively pushing a regionalization strategy is Europe, right? In the post World War II, the US comes in with the Marshall Plan. They come in with the gold standard. They come in with a lot of different policies to try to push the European countries together, to bind them together in commerce and their economies, to stand against the Soviet threat, frankly, at the time, right? They had NATO on the one side, but the Marshall Plan, and then the beginnings of the European Community and later the EU. The US was proactive in that. But conversely, the US did not push a regionalization strategy in Asia. And if anything, perhaps they were anti-regionalization there. They wanted sort of divides. And Asia has become far more regionally connected and deeply integrated commercially than the US and North America even is. So just because the US wasn't proactively pushing it doesn't mean that's the reason it didn't happen, because it has happened in other places.
Shannon, we have about 5 minutes left. If we can do a lightning round here to just get through a couple of these questions before we end. In the last couple of months, I've heard officials from as far away as Argentina and Brazil, but also Ecuador and Colombia, talk about at least the possibility that they might get in on some of this friend-shoring, nearshoring. For some of these faraway countries like Argentina, which are really on the other side of the planet, they refer to it less as nearshoring and more as ally shoring. How, when you think about the need to grow the region, the regionalization of the U.S. economy, how far away roughly does that go? I mean, is Argentina, 5,000 miles away, just too distant to really participate in some of these things? Or does the digital economy make that distance less important?
I think you have two parallel things happening. Some things distance will matter. Some things logistics and the physical movement of goods, it will matter. Other things that, right, as you point out, the services or the intellectual property, like that can be further away. And in this regionalization of the world economy, it hasn't been just regionalization, of course. There are examples of globalization, right? And that will matter. You do see EU, US trade. You can see US, Argentina trade as well. That can be part of it. I will say, increasingly as geopolitics guides economics, and I do think the trends we're seeing today will continue for the next decade plus, this friend showing, ally showing will become more prominent. So there'll be opportunities for those who are friends with the United States to align with the United States, those who are friends with China to align with China. I do think we'll see some fragmenting of the world along these lines.
Final question for you, Shannon. If 10 years from now, you and I look back and say, you know what, actually this regionalization story went better than we thought, what would be the 2 or 3 most important things that would have happened in order for that success to take root?
Mm-hmm. The things that would have needed to happen is you need to get at the logistics issues and make it cheaper to move things around and people around. Education will have to improve, but more than anything else, this mindset will have had to change. There will have to be a sense that we're all in it together. If we're all pulling our oars at the same speed together, we'll actually get there much faster and go much further and be more prosperous than if we try to go it alone. So I think that is really the place to start. And then the other parts are tactics and levers that need to be pulled along the way. And I do think that there is a possibility right now. There is a moment when these economic supply chains are in flux, but there's also in flux, as we were talking about, the politics, and it doesn't necessarily have to go back to an isolationist, populist, nationalist view. You could potentially open it up and find allies within this. So I hope that's the conversation we're having a decade from now.
Do you think how do you sell that though in a place like Akron? When you think about going back home, it would be great if everybody could read the book, but people are busy, and so not everybody's going to read a book like this. I mean, and I think that the challenges in selling that message are probably similar in Akron as they are in places like, Brazil's, the industrial belt around Sao Paulo and in Lima. So this question about how do you really communicate this in a way that breaks through some of the political gridlock?
I think one of the challenges in a place like Akron is that people who are working in these factories or in these offices, they don't actually realize where their final services or their goods go. They don't realize actually that the consumer is not within the US shores and that it is far away. They don't realize these connections between a worker in a factory in Coahuila, Mexico, or in outside of Toronto in Canada. And that I think we should be more transparent about, is actually how this works. I don't think we understand, we don't have these conversations in our day-to-day life about how this actually works and that your job depends on somebody else doing their job in another place. I think if we understood that better, then this metaphor of we're all in it together and we're all pulling oars and trying to pull oars in the same direction would make a lot more sense.
Well, and some of it is just through data. I mean, one of the points that you cite in your book, I believe it's from a Peterson Institute study, says that the average American family is probably $10,000 wealthier because of trade than it would be otherwise. And those are the kinds of stats that everybody can understand. I think some of it just comes from books like this and forums like this, where people unambiguously talk about the benefits of trade as well as some of its downsides, which are also real. But the benefit,
I'd add to that is,
yeah,
I think we understand the consumer side, and then the answer often is like, yeah, but what's that savings if I don't have a job to buy anything with, right? And I think what we don't understand is, but the jobs actually depend on the trade too, right? And the good jobs depend on the trade too. And I have a stat in the book that actually jobs that are tied to the international economy that involve trade pay on average up to 20% more than a job that is not tied to the international economy. So if you want that good job, trade is going to get more of those in the United States. It just has to be the right kind of trade, the trade that actually creates jobs here, which is more likely than not the trade with our neighbors.
Shannon, thank you so much for being here this morning. It's such an important book. Again, I encourage everybody to go out and get it. The Globalization Myth, Why Regions Matter. Shannon, it's been great. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Brian. Appreciate it.